All right, Paul, welcome. You are ready to go. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Erica, and it's a great pleasure to address such an esteemed body of theosophists. And first of all, you cannot hear me satisfactorily, can you, Erica? Okay. So I'm going to be talking on the Jyotish situation with regard to the pandemic, which is still in force. But I hope it's going to be a fairly gentle tour through the world of Vedic astrology, so you can always go deeper, but I'm going to try and keep it fairly simple. The picture that you can see there is actually Queen Square, where the Leeds Lodge is based. And we've been based, we started in 1900, and the lodge is number 12, which is one of the white buildings along here on the right hand side. So it's a nice square, very peaceful, actually in the heart of Leeds, and we are surrounded by very busy roads and a number of very tall buildings that seem to be populated mostly by Chinese students, as far as I can tell. So that's Queen Square, where we are based. Now, before I get into talking about the pandemic, I thought I would give a very brief and simple introduction to Vedic astrology, also referred to as Jyotish, which is the Vedic science of light. And as I often say, in my early days, I was a chemist, and I studied photochemistry, which is a branch of physical chemistry. So that was the science of light interacting with matter. Now I study Jyotish, which is also called the science of light. So it's an interesting symmetry with the earlier and later parts of my life so far. So previously I was interested in chemistry. Now doing theosophy, I suppose I'm interested more in alchemy and the journey of the soul. Okay, I'm trying to get this to move, but it's not doing it. Now there, it's done it. So I hope you can see this chart. Today, of course, is the day of the solar eclipse, and yesterday was the summer solstice. So around about 7:40 this morning, there was a solar eclipse which was visible across much of Central Africa, across the Middle East, then across the Indian-Chinese border, and then through China, and then going further south. I think it could be seen in the Philippines and Indonesia. I don't think it was visible from Europe. So quite an interesting day, and we could talk forever about eclipses. I will be referring to the previous eclipse in December 2019, and that was a precursor for the pandemic. But just so that people understand some of the terms, Vedic astrology is not the same as Western astrology, which is based on the seasons. That's why it's called tropical. Vedic astrology is sidereal, so it's based on the planets being against the zodiac, more as an astronomer would see it, so against the actual constellations. We have the 12 signs, just in same as Western astrology: Aries, Taurus, Gemini, Cancer, all the way around to Pisces. Okay, they're all 30 degrees, so it's put in this square system rather than a circle, as I think Western astrology is people are used to. I'll say now that I've never studied Western astrology, so I'm afraid I cannot answer any questions on starting points of Western astrology. The chart to the side is the same, this chart, but put in a different way. And if you look in Vedic astrology books, you may well see this box arrangement. This is the North Indian chart. I prefer the South Indian chart, because you can clearly see the signs as well as the houses. To be fair, most Vedic astrologers that I know prefer this North Indian chart. There is an East Indian chart as well that combines them, but that's much too complicated. I prefer things simple. And being a South Indian man, of course, I won't talk to anybody who uses North Indian charts. Heretics. So there's always something to divide humanity, you'll notice. So I use the South Indian charts. So having shown this and indicating that these are one and the same charts, that's the last time I will be showing a North Indian chart. This here is Cancer, and at 7:40 this morning for London, Cancer was the constellation on the eastern horizon at that time. So that's called the first house, or the ascendant, also called the Lagna, and it's indicated by this bar. And then the going sequence, second house was Leo, third Virgo, and so on. And this, the Lagnas change every 2 hours approximately. So the ascendant degree is nearly 10 degrees, probably about 90 minutes later or so, it would have jumped into Leo, and Leo would have become the first house. Now, Jyotish uses the 2 luminary planets. They're not called planets in Jyotish, we refer to them as graha. So these are celestial bodies that grab us and hold us in their power. So we use the sun and the moon, 2 luminaries, and the 5 visible planets that we can see: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Saturn, and Jupiter. Saturn is right on the limit of what we can see with the naked eye. So these are all the planets that we use. We do not, in the lineage that I am a part of, lineage which is over 500 years old, following Pandit Sanjay Rath, my guru, or one of my major gurus. We don't use these outer planets, Pluto, Neptune, and Uranus. However, the ancients did seem to be aware of these, and increasingly people, particularly I've noticed the Americans, do like to use these outer planets in Jyotish. And indeed, I will be referring to the ingress of Pluto into Capricorn and the consequences. More of that later. We have the 2 shadow planets. They have no physical bodies. Rahu, which I can't actually see on my screen at the moment, but it's up there in Gemini, and Ketu. And these are exactly 180 degrees apart, and are referred to as the karmic axis. And we all have this karmic axis in our charts, and they're always retrograde using these mean node system. So they're going backwards through the zodiac. And these 2 entities, which I'll be describing in a bit more detail in a moment, really are responsible for a lot of the psychological issues that we encounter in life and our karma, along with Saturn. Okay, I'm getting all sorts of things popping up on the screen here, so I don't know if you can see these. It's a bit annoying. Now, in addition to the standard 12 signs, we also use a very ancient zodiac called the nakshatras, or lunar mansions. And there are 20.
Yes, Paul, we can see everything. Don't worry.
Okay. I can only see part of the screen because of my own face appearing there, but never mind. So, oops. I didn't want that. I wanted to go back. So we have 27 lunar mansions. The moon moves 13 degrees, 20 minutes per day. So that distance is referred to as a lunar mansion. And the mythology behind this is that the moon god, Soma, Lord Soma, married the 27 wives of a rishi called Prajapati. and he spent one night with each of his 27 wives over basically across the span of a month. But he spent longer with one of his favourites, Rohini, which is in Taurus, where the moon is exalted. The other wives became jealous of Rohini and complained to the father, who cursed the moon and killed him. Obviously, the wives weren't happy with this, so they asked him to be brought, the moon to be brought back, but the curse was still in place. So the moon waxes and wanes each month. So this is the mythology of the waxing and the waning of the moon. So the moon, when it's growing or bright or waxing, is benefic. But when it's malefic, when it's getting darker in the second half of the month, so it builds up for 14 days approximately, then declines for 14 days. And at the very end of that, when it's a dark moon, which is what we had last night, then it is extremely malefic. And of course, last night we had the terror incidents in Reading that you may have heard about, where there was a mass stabbing and 3 people were killed, unfortunately. So the moon was very malefic last night. So that's something to consider. Rahu and Ketu over the past few months have been in a very malefic part of the zodiac, which I'll come to next. First of all, what is Rahu and Ketu? Well, Vedic astrology uses the mythology quite a lot. It's very important. And the deities and energies associated with these nakshatras are very important and have a direct bearing on our lives. It's best to regard them as forces of nature that interact with the world. In the mythology of the churning of the ocean of milk to obtain Amrita, the nectar of immortality, we can see the gods here on the left, fine body of men, and over on the other side we have the demons, and these two, these severe looking fellows here on the right, and together they were cooperating to churn this sacred mountain using a snake called Vasuki. So here it is. So they were using it as a sort of rod to churn the ocean of milk to obtain Amrita. You may be able to discern at the bottom here that there is an actual tortoise there used to stabilize the mountain, or the churning rod, and that is actually Kurma, an avatar of Vishnu, who gets in, and this is taken to be Saturn. So Saturn, Rahu and Ketu are all very much concerned with our karma. I suppose the starting point for Vedic astrology is something familiar to Theosophists, namely that we believe that we reincarnate, so we have many lives, and that in these lives we work through our karma. And the natal chart for each individual is effectively a blueprint for that point in time for the karma to be experienced in the native life at that time. And we have many lives, so we work through our karmas to ultimately, hopefully, arrive at the point where we don't have any attachments, good or bad. We have no karmas, good or bad, and then we achieve moksha, or final liberation. And Ketu helps us in that direction. Well, all the planets do, but they do it in different ways. So here we have the churning of the ocean to produce Amrita, the nectar of immortality. Now, once they'd got that, the gods were worried that the demons would take the Amrita and use it for themselves, and use it for material purposes, not spiritual purposes. So they plied the demons with drink and a bit of a party, so that they wouldn't know that they were taking the Amrita for themselves. However, there was one demon who was cleverer than the others, and there he is, and he took a sip of the Amrita and became immortal. Well, the son of the moon told Lord Vishnu about this, and he became angry and chopped off the head of this fellow So this demon was beheaded, but he was immortal, so he couldn't die. So Vishnu placed the head in the sky to be the north node of the moon, and the body, the headless body, which we call Ketu, became the south node of the moon. So the north node simply means it's the path of the moon as it circles the earth, going north as it crosses the ecliptic, which is the imaginary path of the sun round the earth. Obviously, the earth moves around the sun, but we pretend that the sun moves around the earth. And as these lines intersect, going north becomes the north node of the moon, or Rahu, and going south, the south node of the moon becomes Ketu. And astronomers do use these points and calculate them, so they don't have any body, they're just mathematical points in space. But they are very powerful, and I'm led to believe that they are associated with strong magnetic fields. So just as important, they are involved in eclipses. So when we have an eclipse, it involves Rahu and Ketu. Rahu can eclipse the sun, for example. So they are the enemies of the sun and the moon, because the sun and the moon spewed the beans to Lord Vishnu and caused them to be split. So they were originally the same body in the mythology. Now, Rahu takes us into obsessions. Rahu is the head. So imagine it's the head of a snake. It's a demon perceived to be snake-type entities. So it's got the teeth, which it can sink into you and take hold of you. So it can never be satisfied because it's got no body. So it just eats, but it's never satisfied. So, if you have Rahu placed in a natal chart for an individual, say in the 7th house, it's good to take the person, if they existed as a normal being in the material world, into lots of relationships. The 7th house is to do with relationships. So you're going to want lots and lots of relationships without ever really being satisfied. So Rahu and Ketu takes you into these problem areas. Ketu is headless because it wants you to go for moksha, or final liberation, where you symbolically lose the head. You don't have the ego anymore. So they represent the dark side of life for an individual that has to be defeated in the pursuit of moksha, or final liberation, immortality. So there's Rahu. So there he is. It's just a head. So that's one depiction. You can see many of these. So Rahu can take you into all sorts of obsessions. Let's see if I can move this a little bit. And in the mundane world, which is the mundane astrology, which is what we're talking about now, the astrology of countries and events and so on, as opposed to an individual and a natal chart, Rahu stands for war and violence, rebellions and riots, politics. It also stands for research and development, nuclear energy, fears and obsessions often created by politicians, which of course is topical at the moment, epidemics and plagues, but also esoteric disciplines, including astrology. Now, for the past few months, Rahu has been placed in a lunar mansion called Ardra, the Ardra Nakshatra, which is a portion of Gemini. It stretches from 6 degrees, 40 minutes of Gemini to 20 degrees of Gemini. Remember, Rahu and Ketu go backwards. So it's been working its way backwards through Gemini. The lord of this nakshatra is Rahu, and its symbol is a teardrop. The deity, the energy involved with this is Rudra, which is a face form of Shiva. And Rudra is the lord of storms. So it brings in issues of death, pain, and suffering. And it's trying to bring in a perception of clarity after, say, a rainstorm. So it's associated with tears of sorrow. If we then look at Ketu, and that's a symbol I've been using for a long time now, over the past 15 years. So this is Ketu represented. It's not broken. It simply doesn't have a head. So it's a demonic figure without a head. So Ketu is the south node of the moon. It represents moksha and final liberation. But in the mundane world of astrology, it represents riots, viruses and epidemics, terrorism, mass death, assassination, wars, physical wars, including, say, economic and internet wars. Also represents mistakes and errors. It can bring unexpected explosions of violence and anger that have been suppressed and denied and then suddenly released. Let me just take that back. So we all have this. So when we talk about the demons inside of us, we're talking about Rahu and Ketu. Now, Ketu has been in a very unpleasant part of the zodiac in Sagittarius, which is opposite Gemini. Remember, Rahu and Ketu are always 180 degrees apart. And this nakshatra is called Mula. There it is. And it stretches from the interface with Scorpio up to 13 degrees 20 of Sagittarius. Oops, it's too sensitive. Now this nakshatra Mula is all about tearing out the roots. So that's a symbol, the tearing of roots, the old roots that are no longer needed so that new growth can take place. The goddess is called, the deity is the goddess Niriti, who is a goddess of destruction and dissolution of tamas. So we have the three gunas, Rajas, Tamas, and Sattva. Tamas, of course, is this feeling of darkness or inertia. Rajas is a feeling of movement and brio and movement and, bright red colors, if you like, movement. And Sattva is a calm, the sort of peace and tranquility, the deep stillness that comes, say, from meditation. And these three gunas are all present at the same time, but the degree varies. So we want this feeling of tamas or inertia to bring in more sattva through meditation. So Niriti is the goddess of destruction. Unfortunately, in the material, mundane world, these things that we've talked about, mass death, terrorism, viruses, do manifest physically. Niriti lives in the kingdom of the dead, so associated with violence and cruelty. And there she is. Well, that's Niriti is a form of Kali. So all these gods are related. They have many manifestations. So this is the charming Kali who collects heads and skulls round her neck. And as you can see, it's quite a fierce disposition. Plenty of weapons there. So going about a task of destruction. So probably not the kind of lady that as a fellow would want to take back to meet his parents. But there she is doing her job. So I've been describing all that just to give a very brief and simple introduction to Vedic astrology and to emphasize the importance of Rahu and Ketu and the positions that they have been in over the past few months. Because you can see that the significations are quite intense and they're in a portion of the zodiac in Gemini and Sagittarius that are really very destructive. Now, the theme of the talk I'm going to be referring to the solar eclipse of the 26th of December 2019, which was in Sagittarius. And although the COVID-19 virus didn't start at that point, in a sense, we can see from this solar eclipse what was coming, what was down the line. I'm going to be, again, talking about the axis of Rahu and Ketu, so have done that to a large extent. I'll be talking about the curse of Jupiter that was in Sagittarius at the time that a lot of this was taking place, and then it jumped into the next sign, which is Capricorn. Jupiter is the great benefic, which protects humanity. And of course, the planet Jupiter is a big gas giant, and it physically, it is believed, protects the Earth from, comets and meteorites or anything passing through that could cause us some damage. So it's there as the protector of humanity. And in the natal chart, Jupiter is the great benefic most of the time. I'll also be talking about the planetary conjunctions in Capricorn, which involve Mars and Saturn, then Jupiter, and then I'll be talking about Pluto as well, because that's had an impact. And then I'll finish with what's called the Jyotish charts, which will be just showing the charts for some of the countries to show what's going to be happening this year. I won't be going into a lot of detail of this, but I'm sure people want to know where all this is going with the pandemic, etc., and all the other developments that have taken place subsequently. So there's the solar eclipse for December 2019, 26th of December for London. And as you can see, all the activity is in Sagittarius. Now, Sagittarius is ruled by Jupiter. It's a benefic sign, and it refers to higher knowledge, higher principles, higher centers of learning, wisdom, temples, so very nice. Unfortunately, when it's afflicted, it also brings out, say, religious fanaticism. As you can see, we have 6 planets there, 6 graha, including Ketu. Rahu is over there. And the eclipse took place at 10 degrees Sagittarius. The sun and the moon are conjoined there, look. So that's the solar eclipse. You can take the Earth as being here watching all this. So we have Saturn, Ketu, Jupiter, and Mercury. And outside of this, we have Mars and Venus. So all the planets, all the visible planets, are in 3 signs. When you get a mixture of planets like this in one sign, a build-up, it's called a stellium, it can bring in a lot of confusion because all the planets are, together, and there's no elbow room, so the energies get very confused. All planets in 3 signs is not a particularly good combination because it's called a Shula yoga. The word yoga means a combination or association of planets that produces specific effects. So all planets in 3 houses means that Mars, a malefic, becomes the dominant planet, and it acts as like an ignition power, an ignition energy, that can start things. Mars, of course, is associated with violence and conflict. Ketu is the higher vibration of Mars, and Rahu is the higher vibration of Saturn. So Rahu and Ketu are malefics themselves, hence the association with wars and violence and terrorism and so on. So Mars becomes activated as a dominant planet. It's in its own sign, Scorpio, so it's very strong. And being a water sign and Agni, the Agni Tattva, or the fire element, it's associated with fevers. And that seems to be what we've been associated with. Ketu, of course, we've already said, is associated with viruses. So we can take it that this point is giving us an indication of the Covid-19 virus that was on its way. Well, it was effectively active at this time. Okay. Now, it was known for the past few years that something quite unpleasant was coming this way at this time, and it was, mentioned in the conferences that I attended that this would be a dangerous time. And indeed, I gave a talk on the potential of this early on this year, before the COVID-19 pandemic was just starting. But I don't think anybody realised to what extent and the influence it would have. So people were aware that there was something nasty coming down the line. Now, January 2020, obviously these planets are moving around the place. So, some of the planets had moved on. They move at different speeds. The moon is the most fast moving. Jupiter, the great protector of humanity, was severely afflicted. It was cursed, in effect. When we use the word curse, we mean under an affliction by at least 2 malefics. In this time, and I've got the 15th of January chart there, Jupiter was afflicted by all the planets. So Jupiter was conjunct the malefic Saturn, great malefic, Ketu, a malefic, and there was what was called a scissors yoga, where this sign, the whole of Sagittarius, is sandwiched between Mars and the Sun, both malefics. So this is called a Papakatari yoga, and is very malefic. So there was no protection from humanity when Ketu and Rahu are in these particularly painful parts of the zodiac that are creating mass death and destruction. So the protection for humanity was evaporating, it wasn't there. So during this period, we were finding a rising death toll as the world became aware that the COVID-19 virus was spreading fast. So a very unfortunate situation. 24th of January, Saturn jumped, it was moving gradually towards the sign of Capricorn. And on the 24th of January, it crossed over. You can see here, 15th of January, it's at 29 degrees. So very close to the edge. That itself stresses a planet when it's close to the edge of a sign. So 24th of January, Saturn jumps into there and effectively made the situation worse because it strengthened this malefic scissors yoga on Jupiter and Sagittarius. So even though Jupiter was in its own sign and quite strong in its own sign, it was under severe affliction from all these malefics. Now, Ketu and Rahu spent 18 months in each particular sign. As I say, they're an axis, so they're moving backwards through the zodiac. Ketu is heading towards Scorpio and Rahu is heading towards Taurus. So while they're in these signs, and particularly the destructive portions that we talked about, the Ardra lunar mansion and the Mulla lunar mansion, we can go back in time 18 to 19 years to see what they were doing previously. So this is the way that we work for mundane astrology. Obviously, the charts over time are not identical by any means, but we can look at particular positions of planets to see what was going on and the sort of effects that they had. So, of course, 2001, what do we find? We had the 9/11 terror attack and the subsequent wars, basically the war on terror, if you want to believe that. So, we were all around in 2001. I can remember these 9/11 attacks very clearly. And, we were thinking there was going to be another major terror attack. I was going to be traveling due to go to New York to see the lodge in New York, where I'd made contact with someone who's become a friend now, when I first visited India and went to the headquarters. So I was due to pop over to New York at the invitation, but after speaking with astrology friends, we decided to call it off because we thought that, the terror situation would be too severe. So that was a lucky escape for me. Otherwise, I'd have been stranded in New York for several months with nowhere to stay and running up a very nice bill. If we go back in time to the early 80s, when K2 was in Mulla Nakshatra, we find the AIDS pandemic and the subsequent intense medical research to come up with something to tackle AIDS. If we go further back in time, we find the assassination of President Kennedy was taking place and the build up to the Vietnam War. If we jump back in time to the same round K2 in Gemini and Sagittarius, it was the end of World War II. Of course, the dawn of the nuclear age, and there was mass death with the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Rahu, as I mentioned, is associated with nuclear energy and research and development. If we go back in time before that, to the mid-20s, there was a general strike taking place in the UK, civil war in China, and influenza was killing people. So this is the series of events over the past 100 years. If we go back before that, I did look it up, and I couldn't find too much in the, I think it was around about 1908, 1909, but I noticed that there was a lot of activity of in the Balkans with countries going their own way and causing trouble, and also in the Ottoman Empire. And of course, this seems to have been a precursor for the Great War. So, there was something happening before that. It perhaps wasn't appreciated at the time, the significance. Okay, so jumping into February now. So, of course, at this time, we're now aware that there's a pandemic taking place and people are dying. So Mars is now in Sagittarius, and Pluto has crossed, so it's at 0 degrees 0 minutes on the 24th of February. Now, I'm certainly no expert in Pluto astrology, so this is taken from an article written by a friend of mine in America, Barry Rosen, who has a website, Applied Vedic Astrology, I think it is, and .com. Let me just check that. Yeah, appliedvedicastrology.com. And Barry talks a lot on what he calls the astrological weather, so the transits and the significance, and particularly the spiritual significance of these things. He's also an expert on financial astrology. And these outer planets are actually used for financial astrology because although they have not a great deal of effect on an individual's chart, they do affect the mass consciousness, it would appear. And of course, mass consciousness is related, financial astrology is related to the mass consciousness, buying and selling of stocks and shares and commodities and so on. So when Pluto moved into Capricorn, which is ruled by Saturn, so Saturn's quite powerful there. Saturn being on the limits of the solar system that we can see with the visible eye is all about structure and setting boundaries. So you do need to set boundaries to things, which is good management practice. So a strong Saturn does mean you can be a good manager, for example, because it's all about setting boundaries and limits. We do need this. If you don't have boundaries and limits, then you are not honouring Shani, the deity behind Saturn, which isn't a very good idea. So we do need boundaries, and countries do need boundaries, whether people like it or not. Pluto moving into my chemistry coming out there when I see PL, I read it as a platinum, but Pluto with Saturn apparently brings about life-changing global events and disturbing power grabs by people in authority. Crises that change the structure of society. So Capricorn is an earth sign. It's all about the structure of things. Saturn is the Lord, so it's about structure and limits. Apocalyptic paranoia and mass hysteria. and Saturn is going to remain in Capricorn till April 2022, although it is currently retrograde at the moment, and I think it's about to enter Sagittarius briefly. Planets, apart from the Sun and the Moon, that always go direct, and Rahu and Ketu, that in the system that I use, are always retrograde. But the other 5 planets can mostly direct, but they will go retrograde. And at the moment, I think there's 4 planets retrograde. Mercury goes retrograde 3 times a year, so it's often going backwards. And poor Mercury gets the blame for travel problems and IT problems. So Pluto conjunct Saturn is bringing up a lot of paranoia and hysteria. And of course, this is what we were finding. And a lot of this paranoia, I have to say, was coming from certainly the British government, but probably governments around the world and organisations associated with health and so on, that were really spreading a lot of fear and providing contradictory information. If you read some of the things that they were saying, one minute you shouldn't wear a mask, the next minute you have to wear a mask, then you don't wear a mask, and you do wear a mask, and on it went, and it was clear nobody really knew what they were doing. Okay, the other planets are now moved on, as you can see. So we're really focusing about what's happening with Sagittarius and Capricorn. And I'll mention about Mars in a second, going into Aquarius just a moment. So all this time, of course, you know, people are dying around the world. And, you know, we were having from our government daily press briefings that were, I think, shedding not much light on the situation. 22nd of March, Mars moved into Sagittarius, from Sagittarius into Capricorn. So it moved from Sagittarius into Capricorn, where it joined Saturn. Now, Mars and Saturn are both malefics, and the combination is called a Yama Yoga. Yama is the god of death in the Vedic world, and clearly it can translate into physical death in these situations, but Yama is not something to be feared as such. It's more associated with Vayu, the wind element, but it is a malefic combination, Mars and Saturn. Often these things, of course, mean transformation, death meaning transformation, but clearly here in this case, it was a symbol of what was actually happening in the real world. Capricorn, one of the indications of Capricorn is the graveyard. So Lord Yama, god of death, is sat in the graveyard waiting for Jupiter to turn up, the great benefic and savior of humanity. So Jupiter in Capricorn is actually debilitated, so it's not nearly at full strength. However, being conjunct Mars, it's the debilitation gets cancelled. That's not such a good thing in this circumstance, because the action of Jupiter is to expand things. Saturn contracts things. It's a cold, windy planet, but Jupiter expands. It's full of joy. It expands joy. Unfortunately, it's sat with Lord Yama, so it's expanding death. So not a very happy situation there, I'm afraid. And all the time we have Rahu and Ketu still in these awkward parts of the zodiac. Ketu is actually at 9 degrees, nearly 10. And if you remember, the solar eclipse of 2019 in December was at 10 degrees Sagittarius. Now, these eclipse points are very potent. So anything crossing them, you know, triggers an activity. And we all know what Ketu does. It's associated with mass death and pandemics and viruses. So I'm sure you're beginning to see the picture that we have this build-up of several planetary alignments, the Rahu-Ketu axis, the activity in Capricorn, Jupiter not being able to protect humanity. So, you know, death was spreading around the world. And on the 8th of April, in the UK at least, we had the maximum number of deaths reported. So the thing takes a few days to manifest itself. And then, of course, if you're in the vulnerable groups, it can prove fatal. We did actually have we think we had the bug in this house in early February. I didn't get it, but a friend of mine who lodges here, we think he had it. He was never tested at the time, but the NHS did say that he had the bug. So, you know, the thing is real. It does exist, and it was killing people. 4th of May, the Yama Yoga was broken when Mars jumped into Aquarius. So from that time, you know, once Saturn and Mars had the exact conjunction on the 31st of March, Mars was moving away, and you could say that the deaths around the world were then starting to decrease, but they were still very high, of course, and there was a lag period. However, Mars moving into Aquarius, Aquarius is the sign of humanity and good causes, and Mars is the spiritual warrior bringing conflict. So it did bring out certain frustrations around the world that are beginning to manifest over the past few weeks. Basically, there was violence breaking out. So Ketu and Rahu represent riots, rebellions, you know, lots of violence, you know, and this is what started to happen. 20th of May, Rahu actually left Ardra, so it's gone. So there was some relief then. That should be Ketu. 23rd of September, Ketu will be leaving Mulla and crossing into Scorpio. So all these planets are going clockwise. Ketu is going anti-clockwise, as is Rahu. Rahu appear. Now, there are 3 particularly unpleasant borders in the zodiac where fire and earth signs meet. So one of them is this Cancer Leo. Cancer is Jala Tattva, a water sign. Leo is Agni Tattva, fire sign. Here, Scorpio is water, Sagittarius is fire, and here Pisces is water, and Aries is fire. Now, this is the most malevolent of the 3 because it involves Scorpio, which is a very deep sign. It's the natural 8th house, Aries being the 1st house, the natural 1st house. When the sun moves into Aries, that's considered to be the start of the spring season, of course, in Western astrology. Scorpio is 8th from there and is considered very malefic. So this border is a very malefic border. It's called a Gandanta, so it's like a karmic knot, particularly within 48 minutes of arc either side. So any planets there cause major problems in life. So when Ketu crosses this border from Sagittarius into Scorpio later on in the year, September, then there might be a bit of a sting in the tail. Whether that's a second wave or not, I don't know. I'll have to wait and see. Won't be surprised. There will also be an aspect from Saturn onto Mars once Mars moves into Aries, which into Pisces around about this time, which itself is obviously a Yama Yoga, so there could be a second wave. We'll have to wait and see. Incidentally, round about 7 degrees of Sagittarius is the galactic center, Sagittarius A, and that itself is considered quite a potent part of the zodiac. So this is the galactic center that Ketu will be crossing. And it was on the 9/11 tragedy, I think Ketu was sat almost exactly on this point, round about 7 degrees of Sagittarius. So it was right on the galactic center, and that's where it more or less is at the moment. So the point I'm trying to make is that there's a series of cycles because Rahu Ketu moves around the zodiac every 18 years. Saturn and Jupiter come together every 20 years, but they meet up in particular signs, and therefore the element becomes very important. And the last time Saturn and Jupiter were in Capricorn was around about 1961. Jupiter stays in a sign for a year, although there's a bit of oscillation because it goes retrograde and then direct again. It's retrograde at the moment. But these Saturn-Jupiter conjunctions in Capricorn change society. If you can think of the 60s, the early 60s, it brought about great cultural change in the world, in pop culture, but also the emancipation of women and so on, those civil rights acts. There were all sorts of things, abortion, Vietnam War, and so on. So these things are neither good nor bad, depending on your viewpoint. What it's saying is Saturn-Jupiter conjunctions change society for the next 20 years. And this is what we're seeing at the moment. Society is being changed. I'll be coming back to that shortly. Anything else happening? Well, I've been told by my guru Sanjay Rath, looking at the NASA websites, that the sun is asleep at the moment. There's a lot of sunspot activity as part of an 11-year solar cycle. The sun is asleep, and the sun represents wealth and health. So if the sun is figuratively asleep because of a lot of sunspot activity, then we can see the wealth of the world going down, which of course is what's taking place with the economic and depression activity that's taking place. Venus is retrograde, and at the start of the riots that we've been experiencing was combust, i.e. very close to the sun, and actually hidden from behind the sun for a while. So Venus represents peace and harmony and tranquility. So if that's going down, it means the violence in the world is go up. So that's an observation that somebody has posted, that Venus going retrograde and or combust and hidden from view, and violence in the world becomes prominent. We have also got a Jupiter 60-year cycle called the Samvatsaras. That just is the Sanskrit term for a year. And each year carries a particular essence that correlates with its Sanskrit name and relates to a 5-year group that it's in. In 2019, the name was Vikari, which indicates that there would be sickness, disease, and a demonic element to it, particularly towards the end. Now, these Jovian years run from March to March. They're not the calendar year. So basically from December 2019 up to March, the end of March, sickness and death was predominant. And then in March 2020, for 12 months, a more auspicious year starting. It's one of the Sarvari is one of the names of Kali, and it means dark, because Kali is dark, as you've seen, the image that I showed earlier. And it also means killing. What it means is that Kali killed a demon that had viral blood, a drop of which could create another demon. So if you stabbed it or attacked it and it shed blood, it would just create more demons. And of course, this is what we've been experiencing with the virus. It's been expanding. So Kali saved the day by cutting off the head of this demon and drinking the blood. So last year, which finished using this particular system, this particular cycle of Jupiter, it finished in mid-March, was all about death. And now this year is about finding a solution. So the virus will be defeated this year is the good news after all this bad news we've been experiencing. However, I think this year also will bring in famine. And I'm told, I haven't checked, but I'm told that there are locust plagues taking place, presumably in Africa, that will bring famine if it isn't already taking place. So that's the situation. COVID will be reduced, and we think a solution will be found to it. Whether you want to take the vaccine or not is another matter. But basically, the period 2017 to 2022 is a challenging period with much calamity. Now, I am trying to do some research on these years to find out more detail. They are mentioned in books, and indeed I have attended lectures on this sort of stuff at conferences. But there's not a lot of information, descriptive information that would be of use. But some of it has been given out by people who are who do know about these things, coming from a Hindu background. They have been able to provide some of the detail. So, to sum up, what we've been observing is that there's been very difficult and challenging planetary alignments. Rahu, Ketu, critical, they've been in critical areas of the zodiac that have been associated with mass death and destruction. And we can see these over the 18, 19-year cycles that, it's had very unfortunate consequences for humanity. We've also had particular conjunctions that have indicated that it's going to accelerate the idea of mass death, and Jupiter's not been able to provide much relief from this. So things have gradually improved, and things are getting better, but we're not out of the woods yet. Ketu is still in a difficult part, so we're still seeing the virus spreading in parts of the world, though presumably the worst effects are over by now. Clearly, in some parts of the world, like in Brazil, it is still there and very active. Now, we can use a technique called making a Chetra Shukla chart, which gives the fortunes of a country based on the capital city. This is obviously based on the UK, London, for when the sun and the moon are at the same degree in Pisces every year. So, this is a chart which you can use to predict for the coming 12 months for a particular country. So it ties up more or less with the spring solstice, few days difference. So for the UK and for Europe as a whole, so this is the same chart, say for Athens. I did write an article where I made an error saying Brussels, the EU, would be in Taurus, the first house here. So that's not the case. For all of Europe, the first house is Gemini, but the actual degree is different. So for the UK, it's 3 degrees of Gemini. There are other charts that sit underneath these if you want to do the calculations. So the computer does it all for us now. So there will be differences, fine differences for each particular country for these charts that sits alongside the main general chart, which we call the D1 chart, the divisional first divisional chart. So what we can see is that the first house is Gemini, and of course the solar eclipse of today has taken place in Gemini. So this might indicate the first house is associated with the identity. So it indicates perhaps our identity is going to change. I mean, clearly things are changing, but we have left the European Union now. Brexit is behind us, though we're in a transition period. But we can perhaps see that our identity and the identity of Europe is going to change. You'll notice all the planets are on one side of this Rahu-Ketu axis. There's nothing down here. Now this is called a Kal-Sarpa Yoga, which Sarpa means snake. So all the planets are between the Rahu and Ketu. It's like all planets are in between the teeth of the snake, if you like, which is not a good place to be. And all the planets are heading towards Rahu, which is a more material way of looking at things. This is called a garland yoga. All the planets are in a line. So we have the Kal-Sarpa yoga, which splits the chart, and I suppose symbolically you could say this is the splitting of Britain from the rest of the continent. And all the planets are in a line. So it starts, if you like, at Jupiter as the first visible planet, which is the 7th lord, and it ends in Venus, which is in Aries. Now, several points here. This is the 7th house, which relates to other people. So it means relationships with other countries. So Jupiter is there and Ketu is there. Ketu does separate. So, this can indicate a source of separation. Unfortunately, Jupiter is called the Bardika for a Gemini Lagna. So this is not Jupiter is not particularly good for Gemini Lagnas. It also indicates foreign things. So, you can see there is a split here. Also, all the planets visible planets are in just 5 signs. So this puts an emphasis on Jupiter as the ignition planet. So the Bardika causing a split is the ignition energy. All planets in 5 signs indicates a yearning for freedom and a feeling of being trapped, and also an element of some deceit, perhaps in negotiations. So this applies to the whole of Europe, this chart, even though this is specifically for London. So there may be that the rest of Europe, the countries that make up the EU, begin to feel trapped and have a feeling of wanting freedom in some to a greater or lesser extent. So from the EU's point of view, in Brussels, this may not be such a good situation. We have Saturn and Mars, Yama, god of death, in the 8th house. Now, the 8th house represents disease and death and transformation. And so, of course, the UK has had a great deal of death from the COVID virus, and will probably experience even more death from all the diseases that have not been treated whilst the hospitals have been dealing with the pandemic. So cancer, heart disease, and even things like suicide and mental health issues and so on. We have seen a lot of this in the 3 months since March, and, I anticipate that there will be some more. The Lagna Lord is Mercury in the 9th house, which is good. So overall, that's a very positive thing for the Lagna Lord to be in the 9th house. So this applies to the whole of Europe. And there is also an exchange, because Mercury rules Gemini and Rahu is a co-lord with Aquarius. So there is what's called a Parivartana Yoga, an exchange of lords, because they're in each other's signs. Mercury is in the sign of Rahu, Rahu is in the sign of Mercury in Gemini. So this strengthens both planets. So the Lagna Lord being good, being strong, is very positive. And the 9th Lord, Rahu, having the energy as if it was in its own sign. It isn't, it's in Gemini, but it gets the strength as if it was in its own sign. So that's very positive. The other 9th Lord, Saturn, it's gone to the 8th house of transformation, but it also rules Saturn. So the 9th Lords are strong. The 9th Lords means Dharma, righteousness, the world. So overall, I am fairly positive that for Europe at least, and for the UK, even though there are bad things happening, and there's certainly indications of economic misfortune, one of which being Venus, which represents free enterprise, being in a fire sign could indicate, say, businesses being metaphorically burnt. So there is economic problems. The Sun gets strength from being in the 10th house. It is the 3rd Lord of enterprise and also neighbours. So in the 10th house, it gets what's called Digbala directional strength. So Sun in the 10th house is well placed. So overall, mixed blessings. The Kalsarpa Yoga is not good, but there are positive things with the Mercury and Rahu and the Sun being giving positive development. And Jupiter is in its own sign, Sagittarius, even though for this chart it has a bad influence, being what is called the Bardika. So it acts like Rahu, which is considered a malefic, of course. If we consider other countries, then the Lagna changes. So China is Leo. So this is taking place in the 11th house, and Mercury, which is this, if we take this with the Lagna, then Virgo here, then it's not the 4th house, it becomes the 2nd. It's lorded by Mercury, which is gone. This then becomes the 7th house. If you count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That's in what's called Marana Karikasthana, which produces death-like suffering. Mercury doesn't like to be in the 7th house, so it indicates major economic problems for China. It also indicates they're going to probably face opposition on the domestic front, and they will certainly face opposition on the international front, which of course is already happening. So not a good situation for China, but it's a big place, and I'm fairly sure they'll come through it all, but nevertheless they're going to have difficulties. It's just that some of this may manifest in terms of military action. India, I think, is Cancer for this particular chart. Again, indicates domestic problems and lots of economic problems, but they will get through it. America, for this particular chart, Chaitra Shukla, is Capricorn, which of course we have Saturn and Mars, and that indicates a high death toll as well as more economic problems. So, and problems with its overseas as well. So both China and America are going to experience difficult international relations. That may be with each other, of course, but they will both also experience economic difficulties. Let me just go back. I think you can all see that I have changed it to screen sharing. I also study esoteric numerology, and we had a lecture on the tarot a few weeks ago that I listened, and someone mentioned gematria. So I thought I'd just have a look at the word COVID-19. And if we look at the vowels, the O and the I, these are the numbers ascribed to these two vowels. So 6 and 9 makes 15, which reduces to 6. It's the devil in tarot, so it has a karmic significance. So it indicates a choice to be made. Are we going to go for the higher mind or the lower mind? And of course, with this period, which many people have probably used for reflection, have we used it to let the fear get to us, or have we used it to go for the higher mind with meditation and so on? If we look at the C, V, and the D, this adds up to this master number 11. 11 is a very critical number. It indicates a rising consciousness, severe crisis. If you get lots of 11s appearing in the chart of an individual, it can indicate that the process of initiation is taking place in this life. Things happen on the 11th, like the 9/11 disaster. World War I ended at the 11th hour on the 11th day of the 11th month. So 11 has quite a mystical significance. Now, if we add them together, we get 26/8. 26 is a very deep karmic number. It indicates what we call Great Lord Karma. So whenever I see a 26 in a chart, I always know there's some kind of, let's call it trouble, for want of a better word, but people are going to lead very difficult lives. So these numbers just indicate, the karmic influence behind COVID-19. If we add it together with the number 19, we arrive at the final number 45/9. 9 is a number of a cycle being completed. It indicates the number 45, reducing to 9, indicates teaching through experience. So we've gone through this pandemic, the riots taking place at the moment across the world. What is this teaching us? We're going through a particular demanding experience. What is it teaching you? So in conclusion, I've tried to emphasize that, we're caught up in a series of planetary cycles, and they've come together a point of confluence to produce a very difficult time for us, whether it's short term or over bigger cycles of time, or even if we consider solar cycles, which can go back centuries to check what's happening with these eclipses. My view is that COVID-19 is a catalyst for change, and the longer term change will be brought about through the Saturn Jupiter conjunction in Capricorn, even though together for only a year, but they do have an effect that lasts about 20 years. I've mentioned some of the things that were happening 60 years ago, in around about 1961, when they were together at that time. That brought about great changes in society across the world, really. And it's also interesting that the last border conflict in India and China was taking place, where several thousand soldiers on either side were killed up in the Himalayas. And of course, that's broken out again 60 years later. So it's rather unfortunate. There's a lot of fear and paranoia taking place, and that's going to last for the few years until Saturn leaves Capricorn and therefore leaves the malefic influence of Pluto. Pluto will stay in Capricorn for about another 20 years, I believe. And of course, as we are all aware, there are economic woes coming. People are talking about a depression, certainly in this country. I think we're printing money like it's going out of fashion. So it's not a happy period, even though I think we'll probably come up with a cure for the Covid-19 virus, or it will simply disappear, even though it's always going to be with us as a biological entity. Now, we don't want to leave. Jyotish always wants to come up with remedies, and of course, this time is a particularly important time for meditation, leading a sattvic lifestyle, and if you have healing modalities, yoga, or simple reflection, or reading, the good books, theosophy books, the Bible, the Bhagavad Gita, these can keep us grounded and keeping us from basically tearing our hair out, if we have any, and running off screaming down the street. It is a very difficult time, and as the Chinese curse says, I hope you live in interesting times. Well, that's exactly what we are living in at the moment. So with that is the conclusion. Thank you very much indeed.